Horribly Famous, Horatio Nelson and His Victory.
Nelson in nappies.
On the 29th of September 1758, at the little village of Burnham Thorpe in Norfolk, something happened that sounded a bit like this.
Congratulations, Mrs. Nelson. You've had a bouncing baby boy.
Of course, if the midwife had listened to this CD, she'd have been able to say,
Congratulations, Mrs. Nelson. You've had a bouncing baby boy who'll grow up to be a brilliant admiral and get a horribly famous book written about him.
But she hadn't. In fact, nobody could have guessed that little Horatio would go on to become a famous hero. In those days, most famous heroes came from rich and powerful families, and the Nelsons weren't rich or powerful. Horatio's father, Edmund Nelson, was the rector of Burnham Thorpe. In 1749, he'd married Horatio's mother, Catherine Suckling. She was related to a powerful Norfolk family called the Walpoles. Her grandmother's brother was Sir Robert Walpole, the first Prime Minister of England. The Nelsons sucked up to their rich relations, and that was how the new baby came to be called Horatio, after Lord Walpole's father. Although, when he got a bit older, Horatio decided that he didn't much like his name.
Horatio's a stupid name. I want a cool-sounding name, like, I know, Horace.
As well as Horace, the Nelsons had 7 other children, 4 boys and 3 girls. But Horace's most interesting relative was his mother's brother, Captain Maurice Suckling of the Royal Navy. Uncle Maurice was a regular visitor to Burnham Thorpe, and Horace and his brothers and sisters grew up with his tales of life at sea.
Go on, Uncle Maurice. Tell us about how you beat the French.
Oh, it was nothing.
Oh, tell us.
Well, actually, I did once capture 27 ships single-handed.
Horace was a rather sickly, delicate boy and quite small for his age. But he was very brave, and he could easily see off his bullying older brothers. Once, his sister Susanna was asked to stop Horace and William fighting because William was so much bigger and stronger. She just said,
Oh, let them alone. Little Horatio will flatten him.
It's Horace, actually.
When Horace was only 9 years old, something terrible happened. Catherine Suckling died. Horace never really got over losing his mother, and poor Edmund Nelson was left to bring up 8 children on his own. The rector was a kindly man, but he believed children needed firm discipline. He sent the boys to Paston School, which was famous for its tough headmaster, John Price Jones. There, Horace learnt Latin and Greek, and probably got caned a lot as well, since Mr. Jones was a firm believer in flogging.
A fuss about the Falklands.
Meanwhile, in the South Atlantic, just off the coast of Argentina, the Spanish landed on the Falkland Islands, pulled down the British flag, and declared the islands Spanish. The Brits were furious. Ships were made ready, and 12-year-old Horace, heard that his Uncle Maurice had been put in command of a warship called the Raisonnable, which was being prepared to help recapture the Falkland Islands. He knew this was the chance he'd been waiting for. On the 1st of January 1771, young Horace's name was entered on the Raisonnable's muster book as a midshipman. It was his first step on the way to becoming a captain.
Stop calling me Horace. Now I'm in the Navy, I want a glorious, heroic-sounding name, like, Horatio.
Technically, Horatio wasn't even qualified to be a midshipman, as this was his first voyage, but since the Raisonnable's captain was his uncle, nobody was about to argue.
Messing about in boats.
Horatio travelled with his father as far as London, then said his goodbyes, and went on alone to the docks at Chatham, where the Raisonnable was getting ready to sail.
Secret Logbook of H. Nelson.
The 10th of March, 1771. Well, this isn't the welcome I was expecting. There was nobody waiting to meet me when I got to Chatham, and I had no idea how to find Uncle Morris's ship. Finally, an officer from another ship took pity on me and found a boat to take me and my sea chest out to the R. She's not at all what I'd imagined. From the boat, she looked like a great dark wall of sodden wood towering up out of the water, with square lids over the gun ports and a narrow little ladder going up the side. And it was difficult to climb. And I was afraid I'd fall into the gap between the boat and the ship and drown, but I didn't want the common sailors to think I was a coward, so I ran up as quick as I could. And once I got on deck, I found that nobody aboard knew I was coming. Uncle Morris is away for a few days. The officer in charge showed me to the midshipman's berth, which I'll be sharing with about 24 other boys during the voyage. It's right down under the waterline at the bottom of the ship, and it's a dark little low-beamed hole that stinks of mould and tar. There aren't even any beds. We sleep in hammocks hung from bolts in the cabin walls. And even though she's at anchor, the ship keeps rolling and pitching terribly. Homesick. Seasick. Excuse me. The Navy used all sorts of small vessels like brigs, sloops and schooners, but the most important ships were ships of the line and frigates. Ships of the line were large 2- or 3-decker warships which carried 64 to 100 cannons. They were used for fighting full-scale battles. Frigates were smaller, faster ships with 20 to 50 guns. A ship of this size needed a big crew just to shift all those sails, and an even bigger one to fight with in battle. With so many people aboard, it was very important that everyone did as they were told. That's why the Royal Navy had evolved some pretty strict ways of punishing people. Crime, mutiny. Punishment, death. Crime, desertion, or running away. Punishment, death. Crime, drunkenness. Punishment, flogging. Crime, answering back to a senior officer. Punishment, flogging. Crime, theft. Punishment, flogging. Crime, falling asleep on duty. Punishment, flogging. Crime, uncleanliness. That meant going to the loo where you weren't supposed to. Punishment, flogging. One of Horatio's jobs as midshipman was enforcing discipline.
Secret Logbook of H. Nelson.
27th of March, 1771. I'm getting used to life aboard ship, and the rolling and tossing doesn't make me feel so sick now. Uncle Morris is back on board, and we've been loading the storerooms ready for the voyage and bringing the guns aboard. It feels strange to be ordering great big sailors about. Some of them are older than Father and have been all round the world. And I'm telling them what to do, even though I'm only 12 and have never been to sea. But Uncle Morris says I'm a gentleman and they're just common sailors, so it's all right. Soon we'll get our orders to sail for the South Atlantic and war! Hurrah! 10th of April, 1771. Terrible news. The war's off. The government has settled the Falkland Island business peacefully. Now what am I going to do?
Horatio learns the ropes.
Uncle Morris thought Horatio needed some time at sea to turn him into a real sailor. Luckily, One of his old shipmates commanded a merchant ship which traded with the British colonies in the Caribbean, and he was happy to take Horatio on as a junior officer. On board the merchantman, life was very different. There was no punishment, and the gap between officers and men was not so great. Horatio came back a much better sailor, but his next voyage would be much more dangerous and exciting. Nelson got himself on a ship bound for the Arctic.
Nelson Goes North. Secret Logbook of H. Nelson.
4th of June, 1773. At first light today, we made sail in my new ship, the Carcass. We're off to find a way of getting to Japan and China by sailing through the icy seas north of Russia. If it's possible, ships will be able to sail into the Pacific without having to go all the way around the bottom of South America and risk foundering in the horrible tempests and hurricanes of Cape Horn. We're also to test out a lot of new scientific equipment, like a machine for making seawater drinkable and a new device for measuring a ship's speed. We've to make notes on the Arctic wildlife, too. The 10th of July. On one of the ice floes, we saw walruses, fat and blubbery as my brother Morris and nearly as ugly. Some of our scientific gentlemen went for a closer look. When they fired at one of the beasts with their muskets, its friends came sliding down off the ice and violently attacked their boat. Luckily, I had the presence of mind to launch a second boat and drive them away. Hooray for me! By the end of July, Horatio had more than walruses to worry about. The Arctic summer was ending, and soon the ice sheets were closing in all around them. The expedition managed to escape and head for home. It hadn't been successful, but it had given Horatio his first real taste of adventure. And when he got home, Uncle Morris kindly arranged a second helping. Horatio was to join a squadron of ships which protected British shipping in the seas around India. The voyage lasted 2 years. On his way home, he caught a nasty bout of malaria and very nearly died. Even when he recovered, he wasn't a happy Horatio.
Secret Logbook of H. Nelson.
The 5th of July, 1775. Everything's awful. I wish I was drowned. It's going to be months before we reach England, and when we do, what then? There's no war on at the moment. I'll end up living ashore on half pay with nothing to do and no chance of making my fortune. It's not fair. The fact was, Horatio's illness had left him seriously depressed. But as he sailed onward, something happened that would change his whole outlook on life.
Secret Logbook of H. Nelson.
The 6th of August, 1775. Isn't life brilliant? I was resting in my hammock this afternoon when suddenly I had a vision. A radiant orb appeared before me, and I felt a great glow of patriotism. Yes, I'm British, and I must do my duty for my beloved king and country. I'm sure that with God's help, I am destined for fame and glory. 3 billion cheers for Nelson and England. Happily for Horatio, when he reached England, he learned that the French had decided to support the rebel American colonies in their war with Britain. French ships had been attacking British merchants in the Atlantic, so there was plenty of work for the Royal Navy. He just had to impress the Navy Board if he was going to be promoted to lieutenant.
Secret Logbook of H. Nelson.
The 9th of April, 1777. My big day. This morning I presented myself at the Admiralty. I was shown into a large, forbidding-looking room where some large, forbidding-looking men sat behind a long table, and one of them was Uncle Morris. But he just looked at me as if he'd never seen me before. Then they all started asking me questions. I was pretty nervous at first, but the questions were really simple. After a little time they said that they had heard enough. Then Uncle Morris turned to the others and introduced me as his nephew. Why had Uncle M not said who I was before? He explained. He did not wish me to be favoured, but he said, I felt convinced he would pass a good examination, and you see, gentlemen, I have not been disappointed. So, I am now Lieutenant Horatio Nelson of the Royal Navy. Next stop, fame and fortune.
Nasty Nicaragua and Nice Mrs. Nisbet.
The day after his exam, Horatio was given a new job. He was to sail as second lieutenant aboard the frigate Lowestoft, bound for Jamaica. There it was to stop and capture merchant ships from the revolting Americans and help protect British colonies in the West Indies against possible attacks by the French. Soon Horatio was being brave and heroic all over the place, and it wasn't long before he was promoted to command the brig Badger. His speedy promotion may have been partly due to Uncle Morris's influence with the Admiralty, but if so, it was the last time he was able to help. Uncle Morris died in 1778. But with or without an influential uncle, Horatio was going places. In 1779 he was promoted to post captain. The Brits had plans to dig a canal right across Nicaragua, so that ships could sail through into the Pacific without having to go round the nasty pointy bit at the bottom of South America. But the attack on Nicaragua was a disaster. It cost the lives of nearly 2,000 soldiers and 1,000 sailors. Still, some people thought the whole thing might have gone better if the officers in charge had paid more attention to Horatio's advice. Horatio, modest as ever, agreed. He returned to the West Indies in 1784 to stop Americans from trading with the British colonists. Unfortunately, he took his responsibilities a little more seriously than everyone else and made himself very unpopular. But it was whilst he was in the West Indies that Horatio met a widow called Fanny Nisbet. He hit it off straight away with her little boy, Josiah. He also liked Fanny. She was dull, but very pretty, and there was a good chance that she would one day inherit some of Mr. Herbert's fortune. Horatio decided he was in love and asked Fanny to marry him.
What? No war?
Horatio and Fanny were married on the 11th of March, 1787, and later that year they returned to London. But Fanny was soon complaining about the smoke and fogs of London. Meanwhile, Horatio was starting to realise that his behaviour in the West Indies had damaged his chances of another command, and with no wars to be fought, he had to kick around on shore. So the happy couple left London and went back to live at Horatio's father's house in Burnham Thorpe.
Secret Logbook of H. Nelson.
The 8th of January, 1789. Bored, 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 bored. The snow has fallen so thick these past 3 days that the house has been quite cut off, and poor Fanny keeps mostly to her bed, out of the icy draughts. I spend my time studying charts and writing letters to the Admiralty, begging for another ship. The 15th of April, 1789. I do love Fanny, but she does complain so. Perhaps if we had children, things would be different. Young Josiah is all well and good, but I should like children of my own. 21st of June, 1789. Fanny is poorly again. Wrote to the Admiralty, reminding them that I am available to sail at any time. And so Horatio's boring life in Norfolk dragged on. But across the sea in France, things were about to get very interesting indeed.
The Solar Orb, July the 14th, 1789. Frogs hopping mad. Amazing scenes in Paris today. For months, rebellious French peasants and labourers have been moaning that they have nothing to eat, while the rich aristocrats have all the money and land. Today, the grubby grumblers stormed the Bastille prison, where they thought some of their friends were being held. The Solar Orb, June the 20th, 1791. King captured. The revolutionary government now ruling France has captured King Louis whilst he was trying to escape the country, cunningly disguised as an escaping king. He will be taken back to Paris to stand trial. The Solar Orb, February the 28th, 1792. Frog knobs noddles nobbled by newfangled noggin knocker-offer. Every day in Paris, the evil revolutionaries are beheading hundreds of innocent aristocrats on a new bonce-chopping machine called a guillotine. Rumours say King Louis himself will be for the chop when he's been tried. But never fear, Austria and Prussia have formed an alliance to stamp out the revolution and restore King Louis to the throne. The Solar Orb, September the 1st, 1792. Prussians rush in for cover. The King of Prussia's well-trained army has been chased back out of France by the soldiers of the revolutionary government. Meanwhile, in Paris, the terror continues, with innocent men and women losing their heads just for being rich. The Orb says, Britain must act.
Sure enough, preparations for war were soon underway in Britain. The Brits hadn't wanted to get involved at first, but now that their revolution had been such a success at home, it seemed the French were planning to take it on tour and start invading neighbouring countries. In 1793, a small squadron of British ships was sent to see what was happening on the other side of the Channel. One of them was fired on by French guns as it cruised outside the harbour at Brest.
Oh dear, this means war.
Hurrah! This means work! 3 weeks later, orders came for Horatio to go aboard his new ship, the Agamemnon. He could hardly wait, but Fanny didn't share his excitement.
You'll be away for years. At least I'll have my dear little Josiah to keep me company while you're gone.
And that's the other bit of good news. Josiah will be coming with me as a midshipman.
Nipping off to Naples.
The Agamemnon set sail for the Mediterranean, where Admiral Lord Hood's fleet was cruising to and fro outside the ports of Marseille and Toulon to make sure no French warships got out.
Secret logbook of H. Nelson.
The 28th of August, 1793. Amazing news. Toulon has surrendered to us, without so much as a shot being fired. It seems the people there are tired of revolution. They have declared loyalty to the French royal family and have invited our fleet to enter their great harbour. The 4th of September, 1793. Boo. I am not to go into Toulon after all. I shall be very upset if I miss a good battle. Instead, Lord Hood is sending me east to the kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Their King Ferdinand is a relative of poor King Louis and married to Maria Carolina, sister of French Queen Marie Antoinette, whom those dastardly revolutionaries have imprisoned. Lord Hood hopes I can persuade him to send soldiers to help defend Toulon. The kingdom of the Two Sicilies covered the island of Sicily and the mainland south of Rome. King Ferdinand, also known as King Bignose, was a member of the powerful Bourbon family, who was so important that they provided kings for France and Spain too, and had a very nice biscuit named after them. Ferdy and Maria held court in the city of Naples, and it was there that Horatio went with his request for reinforcements.
Hanging out with the Hamiltons.
As soon as he went ashore in Naples, Horatio went to find the British ambassador, Sir William Hamilton. Sir William was a great friend of the King and Queen, and soon he persuaded them to send soldiers to help defend Toulon. Sir William also had a beautiful young wife named Emma. Horatio barely met her on this first visit, but she would one day become the most important person in his life.
So long, Toulon.
Even with reinforcements, the British defence of Toulon didn't last long. Soon the British ships in the harbour were being hammered by French cannons, commanded by a brilliant young officer.
Yes, fans, it is I, Napoleon Bonaparte, the future Emperor of France.
But more about him later. Finally, on the 17th of December 1793, the British left. 15,000 townspeople were able to escape with them, but the rest were left behind to face the angry revolutionaries. Now the Brits decided to try and capture the island of Corsica, which was already in revolt against the French. While watching the bombardment of the French fortress of Calvi, an enemy shell exploded among some sandbags just in front of Horatio, spraying him with sand and stones. His face was cut and bruised, and his right eye was damaged. 3 weeks later, he wrote home to Fanny, "My eye is as far recovered as to be able to distinguish light from darkness, but as to all the purpose of use, it is gone." Later that year, Horatio was promoted to Commodore. This was a temporary rank, which meant that he was in charge of a whole squadron of ships instead of just his own new ship, the Captain. Things were starting to look up a bit, and Horatio hoped that soon he'd have the chance for glory that he'd been waiting for.
Meanwhile, in Paris...
Those repellent revolutionaries were still busy beheading people. King Louis went to the guillotine, and so did Queen Marie Antoinette and the rest of the royal family. A 5-man group called the Directory took over the business of ruling France.
Okay, lads, now we're in charge. What are we going to do?
Let's invade Italy.
Brilliant idea. We'll kick out the Austrians.
And bring back enough loot to fill up our treasuries.
But do we have a general brilliant enough to lead such an invasion?
Luckily for them, they did.
Moi again, fans, yes. I was so fantastic at the siege of Toulon that the Directory has put me in charge of the whole army for this new campaign. Watch out, spaghetti-scoffing Italian-type people. Here I come.
Sure enough, nifty Napoleon caught the Austrians napping, and the invasion of Italy was a huge success. By April 1795, he'd captured Milan. The rest of Italy was so alarmed that the British fleet soon found it hard to find a port anywhere in the country. In Naples, King Ferdinand's enemies were talking about booting him out and setting up a republic. Worse still, the Spanish sided with the French. Holland and Prussia had also been forced to make peace with France, so the Brits were left, more or less, alone. The British ships roared home. But on the way, Nelson's ship came across a fleet of Spanish sail-of-the-line. Admiral Sir John Jarvis, then in charge of the fleet, ordered his ships to turn and fight, though they were badly outnumbered.
There are 27 sail of the line, Sir John, and we've only got 16.
Enough, sir. The die is cast, and if there are 50 ships, I will go through them. England badly needs a victory at present.
Secret Logbook of H. Nelson.
The 14th of February 1795, Valentine's Day. What a day, and what a battle. I don't mind admitting I was nervous as we sailed towards the Spanish fleet this morning. Those Spanish ships were real thumpers. I steered the captain into the midst of 7 Spanish warships. The Spaniards certainly know how to build, but they ain't so good at fighting as our sailors, and their gun crews can't aim so true or fire so quick as ours, which was lucky. Even so, the poor captain got so shot about that our people thought we would have to leave the fighting to others. Well, I wasn't having that. I ordered my crew to ram the nearest Spaniard, the San Nicolas. Then I drew my sword and called for boarders. Lieutenant Berry, leapt into the Spaniard's mizzen chains, and a soldier smashed in her stern gallery and jumped through, followed by myself and my men behind me, all huzzahing and hallooing and waving cutlasses and boarding pikes. We fought our way up through smoke and chaos and confusion onto their quarterdeck, where I found the Spanish sailors already hauling down their flag to show that they had surrendered. But just as we were starting to congratulate ourselves upon our victory, we were fired upon by another ship, the San Josef. As soon as I was sure that we had the San Nicolas secure, I called again for boarders. But as I got into the San Josef's main chains, the ship surrendered. So we had captured one enemy and crossed her to board and take a second, which is something never seen before and most amazing heroic. Meanwhile, the rest of the British fleet were making short work of the other Spanish ships. The Battle of Cape St. Vincent was a huge victory, and at last Horatio had some of the recognition he had always wanted. He was made a Knight of the Order of the Bath, and a week after the battle he heard that, aged just 39, he had been promoted to Rear Admiral. He would be put in charge of whole fleets of ships, or at least large parts of them. Almost as important to Horatio as his promotion was the fact that everyone in England now knew his name and how he had captured 2 Spanish ships.
Armless Horatio.
A lot of the Navy's seamen were sick and tired of low pay and poor conditions. In 1797, the men of the Blanche, one of the frigates in Horatio's squadron, refused to sail under one Captain Hotham, who was a fierce disciplinarian. The crew grabbed guns and crowbars, and for a while it looked as if a mutiny was certain. Then Horatio came aboard, gathered the men round him and said, "Lads, you have the greatest character of any frigate crew in the Navy. If Captain Hotham treats you ill, give me a letter and I will support you."
3 cheers for Nelson! Hip hip hooray! Hip hip hooray! Hip hip hooray!
On his own ship, Horatio always tried to make sure that the men were happy. While he wasn't afraid to flog or even hang men when he thought it was necessary, he often tried to find less severe punishments.
Trouble at Tenerife.
Horatio was soon back in action again, this time leading a squadron sent to attack Tenerife in the Canary Islands. Tenerife's main port of Santa Cruz was still an important stopping place for Spanish treasure galleons on their way home from the gold and silver mines of the New World. 2 such ships were anchored in Santa Cruz when Nelson was sent there. The plan was to anchor out of sight of the islands, make a surprise attack by night in small boats, and grab some of that treasure. The first attack was foiled by bad weather, so the next night Horatio decided to lead the boats in himself, knowing the Spanish would be ready for them. Josiah, who was now a lieutenant, volunteered to go with him. It was a good thing for Horatio that he did. The Brits came under heavy fire as their boats drew near the shore, and Horatio was hit in the right elbow by a musket ball and fell back, saying, "I'm a dead man." Josiah quickly took charge. He clapped his hat over the wound to hide the blood, then made a tourniquet from Horatio's neckcloth, while another sailor ripped up his shirt for a sling. Then he ordered the boat's crew to row back as fast as they could to the waiting ships. As the boat pulled away from the shore, he saw that the water was full of struggling sailors from another boat that had been sunk, and ordered his men to stop and pick them up. When they finally reached Horatio's ship, the Theseus, Horatio insisted on going up the side alone. He told the ship's surgeon to get his instruments ready to amputate the wounded arm. The sooner it is off, the better. The operation was performed without anaesthetic, and later Horatio claimed that the cold knife cutting his flesh was more painful than the sawing through of the bone. Horatio's attack on Tenerife was a catastrophic failure. 153 men were killed, and it was mainly Horatio's fault. He had underestimated the Spanish. He became very depressed. A left-handed admiral will never again be considered useful. But Admiral Jarvis sent Horatio home to recover and promised him another command as soon as he was ready. As for the arm, it was buried at sea, sewn up in a hammock with a dead sailor.
Foiling the French.
All the way back to England, Horatio fretted about what sort of welcome he would get. He needn't have worried. He was cheered in the streets, had an audience with the king, and prints of his portrait sold like hotcakes. As for the Tenerife business, people just put it down to bad luck. Horatio cheered up, but the stump of his wounded arm went septic, and poor Fanny had the job of cleaning it and changing his bandages. Now that they had no need to worry about money, Horatio bought a house in the countryside, and Fanny started setting up home there, while Horatio got ready to go back to sea.
Back to work.
It was now 1798, and the French were in complete control of the Mediterranean. Reports from spies in France said that Napoleon's huge army was preparing to embark from Toulon and Marseille, accompanied by a large fleet of warships. The trouble was, nobody seemed to know where he was planning to take them.
Pah! Why should I tell you, you pathetic, tiny-brained English people?
Horatio's task would be to find out where Nap was off to, and try to stop him.
Secret logbook of H. Nelson.
Oops, can't get used to writing with my left hand like this. 20th of May, 1798, at sea off Toulon. I brought my squadron so close to Toulon that I can see the masts of the French fleet in harbour there. They certainly look as if they're getting ready to sail in the next few days. All we have to do is watch and wait. The 24th of May, 1798. Disaster. My squadron is scattered, my ship is dismasted. A tempest of wind struck us at about midnight Sunday, and all our masts were blown down, one after the next, killing 2 topsail hands. Luckily, one of the other ships towed us away from the shore. We should otherwise have been dashed into pieces. We are now seaworthy again, but the French fleet has gone. The 5th of June, 1798. After 2 weeks, we finally have word of the French. They were last seen heading southeast. I have heard that Napoleon has naturalists, astronomers, and mathematicians with him. I think they are bound for Egypt. Horatio ordered his squadron to set sail at once for Egypt. He was taking a big risk. And when the fleet reached Alexandria, there wasn't a French ship in sight. Horatio ordered them to sail east along the Egyptian coast, but he knew that he was in big trouble.
The Solar Orb, July the 15th, 1798. Nelson, all washed up. Nautical nincompoop Nelson has lost the French fleet. The Orb says, "Come on, Admiral, pull your finger out. How can you lose 13 great big warships and nearly 400 frigates, troopships and supply craft? Have you tried looking down the back of the sofa?"
Horatio hunted around the Mediterranean and eventually discovered the French had been heading for Egypt after all. Horatio went herring back to Alexandria. This time the harbour was full of French ships, but Napoleon's army had gone ashore almost a month earlier and gained control of the country. And the French warships were still nowhere to be seen. Horatio ordered the fleet to set sail again and sat down to a grumpy dinner. But just as he was about to tuck in, roly-poly pudding.
Sir, it's the French fleet. They're anchored in Aboukir Bay.
Meanwhile, in Aboukir Bay...
Admiral Bruet, the English are coming.
Fui. They won't risk a night attack in such shallow water. We'll escape them in the dark.
It was 6:15 in the evening when the first shots boomed out, marking the start of what would later be known as the Battle of the Nile.
The solar orb, September the 5th, 1798. Hip, hip, Horatio! Kaboom! That was the sound that echoed across Aboukir Bay on the night of the 1st of August as the huge French flagship L'Orient exploded. The blast, which was heard 15 miles away in Alexandria, came at the height of a fierce battle between no-good Napoleon's nasty navy and hotshot Horatio Nelson, Britain's most huggable hero. The battle had been raging for nearly 3 hours when fire broke out aboard L'Orient. French Admiral Brueys had already had both legs shot off and had made his men sit him up in a chair on the quarterdeck where he kept giving orders until he was finally killed by a cannonball. His helpless crew could do nothing to stop the flames spreading through their 120-gun, 3-decker ship. At 10 o'clock, the fire reached the powder magazine, and the huge ship was torn apart by a blast which flung broken planks, dead bodies, rigging, guns, and fragments of hull high into the Egyptian night. The battle went on for almost 8 more hours. By the end, some of our brave boys were so exhausted they fell asleep beside their guns. But victory was ours, and although many of our ships were badly battered, none was sunk. Of the French, 4 were sunk and 1 burned, while 7 were captured. Only 2 escaped. The victory leaves Napoleon's army stranded in Egypt. Somehow, we don't think he'll be giving us any more trouble. The orb says, "Nice one, Nelson."
Nobbling Naples.
When Lady Emma Hamilton heard the news of Nelson's victory, she wrote to her hero.
Dearest Admiral Nelson, I am delirious with joy. Good God, what a victory! Never, never has there been anything so glorious. My dress, from head to foot, is a la Nelson. Even my shawl is blue with gold anchors all over. My earrings are Nelson's anchors. In short, we are be-Nelsoned all over.
Once Nelson arrived in Naples, Emma set about preparing a spectacular ball to celebrate both the victory and his 40th birthday. In England, celebrations of the victory were even more frantic. Guns were fired, balls were organised, and pictures of Nelson and Britannia appeared in shop windows and houses all over the country. But the more Fanny heard, the more annoyed she became. Everyone was gossiping about Nelson and Lady Hamilton. On the other hand, Emma's husband didn't seem to mind. The trouble was, Emma and Horatio had fallen madly in love. It was inevitable, really. They had so much in common. Emma thought Horatio was the most wonderful man in the whole world, and so did Horatio. But when Emma heard the news that the British government was making Horatio a baron, she was furious. She thought he should be at least a viscount.
Balmy armies and revolting Jacobins.
In 1799, the French were advancing on Naples, and there were rumours of a revolution brewing in the city. Unlike the French lower classes, the poor of Naples had always loved their king and were still loyal to him. But the richer, better-educated types were sick to death of Ferdinand and Maria. A lot of them were Jacobins, supporters of the ideas of the French Revolution, and they planned to side with the French invaders and turn Naples into a republic. Nelson helped the royal family to escape to Sicily, but the news from Naples was depressing.
The Parthenopian News, formerly the Naples News. 23rd January 1799. Naples welcomes the French. A French army entered Naples today, quickly overpowering the royalist garrison and stamping out any resistance from the angry citizens. The Jacobins have made them welcome and announced that from now on, Naples will be known as the Parthenopian Republic, after the ancient Greek city of Parthenope, which once stood here. A spokesman for the new republic said today, "We can't thank the French enough for getting rid of King Big Nose for us. We're sick of being ruled by a corrupt royal family and their allies, the Catholic Church."
The Parthenopeans weren't a bad bunch, as revolutionaries go. They wanted to make Naples a more free and equal place. But the poor people of Naples weren't interested. They wanted their king and queen back. A priest called Cardinal Ruffo, who had a fanatical hatred of all Jacobins, suggested to Ferdinand that he gather an army to crush the new republic. Ruffo was soon storming towards Naples at the head of a rough old mob of about 20,000 Calabrian peasants and brigands. Horatio didn't trust Ruffo, but he still agreed to lend his ships to help in the attack. The army of the Holy Faith had stormed into the city itself in the summer, but they weren't behaving in a very Christian way. Eventually, Cardinal Ruffo, fearing that his army was out of control, made a deal with the French to release some of the city's strongholds. If they surrendered, the revolutionaries would be shipped home to France, Neapolitans who had supported the Parthenopean Republic would be pardoned and allowed to return to their homes. The French agreed. Horatio was furious when he heard. With Queen Maria's agreement, Nelson got nasty. He broke the deal and had the rebels tried for treason. Men and women alike were tortured in the prisons before being dragged to a public square and hanged in front of a jeering crowd. The executions went on and on for months. 2/3 of the rebels were executed. The rest were returned to France. King Ferdinand was so grateful for Horatio's help that he arranged a huge victory celebration for him back in Palermo and gave him a diamond-studded sword and a new title, the Dukedom of Bronte.
Furious Fanny and Little Horatio.
At the end of August came some worrying news.
I have abandoned my army in Egypt and I have returned to France. Ha ha! So much for your stupid Lord Nelson and his feeble fleet. Now I shall have myself declared First Consul. That means ruler of France, in case you are too thick to work it out.
It looked as though the war wasn't over by a long chalk. When a letter came from the First Lord of the Navy ordering Horatio home, he wasn't sure that he wanted to go. He must have known stories about him and Emma were going around back in London, and he can't have looked forward to having to explain things to Fanny. But the Hamiltons were going home too, so Horatio decided that they could all travel together. They travelled overland, and wherever they went, Horatio was treated like a cross between a famous pop star and the man who's just scored the winning goal in the World Cup final. Not everyone was impressed by Nelson and Emma. Yet, despite some very ugly rumours, nobody seemed to have noticed that Emma was 6 months pregnant.
Home sweet home.
At last, on the 6th of November 1800, they reached England. There were cheering crowds to welcome Horatio at Great Yarmouth. But Fanny and Edmund Nelson were horrified by Horatio's behaviour. So was much of London high society.
The Solar Orb, December the 18th, 1800. Cold shoulder for love rat Nelson. Horatio Nelson may be the toast of London's merchants and common people, but he's not popular with the nobs. At a levee at St. James's Palace, he arrived to meet the king dressed up like a Christmas tree, covered in medals and ribbons, and wearing a clockwork plume of diamonds in his hat. Not surprisingly, good King George gave him a frosty welcome. And he's not the only one. Nifty Nelson may have nobbled Nap at the Nile, but the Orb can exclusively reveal that he's not welcome at any of the posh parties this season.
He's treating poor dear Lady Nelson in the most abominable manner,
said one society hostess.
He won't be welcome at my house, and all my friends feel the same way. Finally, things came to a head with Fanny.
Secret Logbook of H. Nelson.
The 5th of January, 1801. Fanny and I are to go our separate ways. I never mean to see her again. Honestly, she's been so unreasonable. Why can't she see that Emma and I were meant to be together? Poor Emma. Her child is due soon. I wish I could be with her, but I fear it wouldn't do. Thank heaven I can escape to sea. I've been appointed second in command of the Channel Fleet, and shall go aboard my new flagship at once. While I am away, Emma and I will write to each other in code. I'm going to pretend that one of my sailors, Thompson, is in love with one of Emma's servants who is about to have a baby. Cunning, eh? The 22nd of January. Aboard my new flagship at Plymouth. She is a fine ship. The San Josef, one of the ships we captured at the Battle of the Nile, thanks to me, and part of the Channel Fleet, which protects our shores from the wicked French. Missing E. very much. The 1st of February, 1801. Wonderful, glorious news. E's child is born. We have a little girl. I am planning to rewrite my will. But having babies with people you weren't married to was a terribly scandalous thing to do in the 19th century, so nobody else knew that Emma had had a baby, except for her servants, who didn't count, her doctor, who wasn't letting on, and Sir William, who politely pretended not to have noticed. All Horatio and Emma could do was write to each other.
Dear darling Horatio. Oops! I mean Admiral Nelson, darling dear. I have sent Mr. Thompson's little treasure to live with a woman called Mrs. Gibson in Little Titchfield Street. Nobody noticed me take her there. Mrs. Gibson has been paid and will bring up the baby with her own daughter. So no one will ever know she is the child of the mighty Nelson. Sorry, I mean Mr. Thompson. Heaps of love and cuddles. Emma. Kiss, kiss.
Tsar Wars.
Meanwhile, Tsar Paul, ruler of Russia, was behaving a bit strangely. Russia had been against France all through the war. Now, Potty Paul decided to switch sides. He didn't actually declare war on the Brits, but he set about persuading his neighbours to trade with France again and form a sort of anti-British club called the Armed Neutrality League. If the Brits couldn't trade with the northern powers, they wouldn't be able to get hold of the materials they needed to build warships. They decided to send a large fleet north to persuade Russia's neighbours not to join. First stop, the Danish capital, Copenhagen. Doddery old Admiral Sir Hyde Parker was first in command. Second in command was Lord Nelson.
Duffing up the Danes.
After much dithering about, the fleet set sail for Denmark, only to discover that the Danes were prepared for war. Fearing their fleet might join up with the Swedes and the Russians, Nelson suggested an immediate attack.
The Battle of Copenhagen. Secret Logbook of H. Nelson.
2nd of April, 1801. Well, I don't like to sound big-headed, but I really am the most astounding naval genius in the entire history of the world, ever. Sir Hyde Parker gave me command of 12 sail of the line, and at 8 o'clock this morning we began our attack on the Danish fleet. It was like the Nile all over again, with the Danes at anchor in a long line. It looked dicey at first, I must admit. Parker, who was watching from his flagship safely out of range, thought we were taking a beating and panicked. He hoisted signal flags, ordering me to break off the battle. Of course, I wasn't going to obey. I told my officers, I have only one eye. I have a right to be blind sometimes. Then I put the telescope to my blind eye and said, I really do not see the signal. Rather clever, I thought. Must remember to tell Emma. Anyway, the battle banged and rumbled on all morning, and by 2 in the afternoon the poor silly Danes were still fighting. I sent a note to the Danish commanders, telling them that if they didn't cease firing at once, I would burn all the ships I'd captured. A Danish officer came out and arranged a truce, so the battle ended. Another famous victory. I half expected to be court-martialed for disobeying orders, but instead, Sir Hyde seemed very pleased with me. Funny chap. Then to bed, very tired. After the battle, Nelson met the Danish Crown Prince, and a 14-week truce was agreed. Sir Hyde Parker now sailed on to deal with Sweden and Russia, but the Admiralty weren't happy with him and ordered him to hand over command of the fleet to Nelson and return home. Now there was no anxious admiral to hold him back. Horatio sailed straight to the Russian naval base. But there'd been big changes in Russia. Tsar Paul had been assassinated by his own bodyguards, who brained him with a paperweight. And the new Tsar, his son Alexander, wasn't so keen on cozying up to Napoleon and soon disbanded the Armed Neutrality League.
The French are coming. Maybe.
When Horatio came home from the Baltic in the summer of 1801, there was disturbing news.
The Solar Orb, July the 15th, 1801. Crafty frogs barge in. Fears are growing that beastly Bonaparte and his foul French are planning to invade our wonderful country. Nasty Nap is massing thousands of soldiers and landing barges in the harbours of northern France. They are just waiting for a calm night so that they can row across the Channel and attack England. There are also rumours that Nap's engineers are planning to dig a tunnel beneath the Channel and also construct giant windmill-powered invasion rafts. A French invasion would mean British freedom crushed by a foreign dictator. Our Protestant Church of England replaced by the Catholic Church. Funny-shaped bread. The orb says, government must act now to save us from disaster.
Preparations had to be made just in case the French succeeded. And what better way to calm the anxious British people than by appointing their fave admiral to head the defence forces. Horatio was given command of a squadron of frigates, brigs, and floating gun batteries, which were supposed to smash the French invasion barges if they tried to cross the Channel. He was also in charge of the Sea Fencibles, a volunteer force of fishermen and boat owners from the coastal towns who were to help the Navy if the French attacked. But Horatio wasn't altogether happy in his new job.
Secret logbook of H. Nelson.
The 20th of July, 1801. I'm convinced the Admiralty are deliberately stopping me from seeing M. But they say it reassures the public to know I'm always at my post. So, here I must stay. Horatio decided to launch a night attack on Boulogne. It was to be a cutting-out expedition, with men sneaking up in small boats to slice through the mooring ropes of French ships, which could then be brought back to England as prizes. The attack force was to consist of 4 groups of flat-bottom boats carrying sailors armed with pikes, cutlasses, muskets, bayonets and tomahawks. Horatio himself did not take part, and the expedition to Boulogne turned into a total dog's dinner. Strong tide scattered the boats, sweeping some past the target altogether. The French had moored their ships with chains instead of ropes to stop the Brits cutting them out. Heavy nets hung from the yards of the French ships meant that the Brits couldn't climb aboard. Soldiers armed with muskets were waiting to blast the attackers. 45 British sailors died that night, and 130 were wounded, including Parker, whose leg was shattered by a musket ball. Sadly, the wounded leg turned bad and had to be sawn off, and soon afterwards Parker died. Horatio was heartbroken. But at least there was one bit of good news to take his mind off things. Emma had found a house where she and Horatio could live together. Merton Place, a delightful 2-storey country house, handy for London, established garden complete with ornamental canal, needs some small alterations, a snip at just £9,000. Horatio was delighted and called his dream house Paradise Merton. The only fly in the ointment was the fact that Sir William Hamilton was living there too. Then, in April 1803, Sir William finally kicked the bucket. Emma went into deep mourning, but she was probably looking forward to spending even more time with Horatio. What she didn't know was that Napoleon was about to stick his oar in again.
Hello, silly English people. Remember that piece of Amiens? Ha ha! It has given me a nice breathing space to train more armies and build some huge new warships. Now I really am going to conquer Europe, and nothing your soppy Lord Nelson can do is going to stop me.
Follow that fleet.
By May 1803, Britain was back at war with France. Nelson was ordered to sea as Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean and went aboard his new flagship, HMS Victory. He was to spend the next 2 years at sea. At first, it was the familiar old job of cruising off Toulon in case the French fleet came out. In good weather, it was all right, with officers from different ships rowing across to visit each other and amateur dramatics organised to pass the time. But when storms blew up, Horatio suffered terrible bouts of seasickness, which didn't help his temper. French Admiral Pierre Villeneuve was keeping out of Nelson's way. He knew that his men were no match for the experienced Brits. His crews were not as disciplined, and his officers were not as experienced. Meanwhile, in Paris, Napoleon had decided to give himself a swanky new title.
I am bored with only being the first consul. I declare myself Emperor of France. And now the sensible Spanish have agreed to help me in the war with the stupid English.
In January 1805, the French managed to sneak out of Toulon, pass the Brit fleet under cover of darkness, and escape into the Atlantic. Nelson's fleet chased the French all the way to the West Indies and back again. But with the help of their new Spanish ally, the French fleet nipped into the safety of the Spanish port of Ferrol. Horatio was as sick as a parrot. But in a way, the hunt for Villeneuve had been one of his greatest achievements. After 2 whole years at sea, he had led his tired and weather-beaten fleet halfway across the world and back. Not many people could have done it. And with Villeneuve cowering in Ferrol, the threat of French invasion was over for the time being. In August 1805, he finally took a well-earned break and came home to England for the last time.
Trafalgar.
Now that Britain was at war again, the country needed heroes, and Horatio Nelson was still the biggest hero of the lot. He was also one of the first celebrities of the age of mass production. There were Nelson mugs, Nelson jugs, Nelson boxes, Nelson fans, Nelson brooches and Nelson hankies. Print shops sold cartoons of him, and as for portraits, so many painters and sculptors wanted to make likenesses of him that at one point he was posing for 2 at the same time. I'm not used to being attacked from both port and starboard. In London, Horatio was mobbed wherever he went. But at Merton Place, he was finally able to lead the life he had dreamed of with Emma. And now, Horatio was there too, although officially she was an orphan, and Horatio and Emma were her godparents. On the 2nd of September, a messenger arrived with news from the Channel Fleet.
Admiral Villeneuve's fleet has left Ferrol and taken refuge in Cadiz, with more than 30 French and Spanish ships of the line.
Soon afterwards, Horatio left for Portsmouth, where the Victory lay at anchor, and by the end of September he was in the waters off Cadiz. 2 days later, on his 47th birthday, he invited 15 of the other captains to a party aboard the Victory, and while they were there he told them his plan for flummoxing the enemy. The French are so behind the times. They will fight by forming their ships up in a long line. I shall divide our ships into 3 divisions. The fastest will be kept in reserve. The other 2 divisions will go straight at the French line here and here. They may have more ships than us, but our gunners can fire faster and straighter. By the time the ships at the front of their line can turn back to help, we will have destroyed their rear and centre. Now it was just a question of waiting for the French to leave Cadiz. And in Paris, Napoleon was starting to get impatient.
Pah! Admiral Villeneuve is le tweet supreme. Last year he fluffed up our chances of invading England. Now he is hiding in Cadiz. I have had enough of him. I have ordered another admiral to take over and sail into the Mediterranean.
On the 20th of October, the Brits saw the French and Spanish ships set sail and leave Cadiz. Horatio ordered his ships to steer a parallel course, but not so close that they would scare Villeneuve back into port. All through the night they sailed, and at 4 o'clock the next morning, Horatio ordered a sudden change of course that would bring the 2 fleets together. There was no avoiding a ginormous battle now. All night, Horatio had been having his usual premonitions of death. As the French fleet drew closer, he asked 2 of his captains, Hardy and Blackwood, to put their names to a document asking that the British government look after Emma and Horatio should he get killed.
The biggest battle of them all.
Now the fleet was almost ready to close with the enemy. Horatio decided to send a signal to the rest of the fleet to buck up their spirits. England expects that every man will do his duty. Meanwhile, Nelson's officers were getting worried about his choice of outfit.
With all those medals and decorations, the French sharpshooters are bound to spot you.
Nonsense. I'm not afraid to show my medals to the enemy. There was no time to argue. It was the 21st of October, 1805, and it was about lunchtime. In other words, it was time for the Battle of Trafalgar. The Victory sailed towards the front of the French line, then turned to attack the Bucentaure and another French ship, the Redoutable. The Victory crashed against the Redoutable, whose sharpshooters were the best in the whole enemy fleet. Meanwhile, a huge Spanish ship attacked the Victory from the other side. The Victory's wheel was smashed, and she had to be steered from below deck with orders shouted down by speaking trumpet. Another British ship, the Temeraire, attacked the Redoutable from the other side. Hurrah! It's all going just as I planned. But high on the Redoutable's mizzen mast, a sharpshooter caught a glint of Nelson's shiny medals. Oh, they've done for me at last, Hardy. My backbone is shot through. Nelson was taken to the sick bay on the lowest deck. You can do nothing for me. I have but a short time to live. Meanwhile, the leading French ships turned back to help their fleet, but the wind was too light and 5 of them couldn't even reach the battle. The French ships were becalmed. The Brits began to get the upper hand. By about 4 o'clock, the gunfire started to peter out. Captain Hardy came down to the sick bay to tell Horatio that he had won a brilliant victory. Horatio was very weak by that time, but he was still able to give orders. He could feel, by the movement of the ship, that a storm was on its way, and he told Hardy to anchor. He also asked him not to throw his body overboard and to look after Emma. Then he said, "Kiss me, Hardy." Captain Hardy stooped and kissed his cheek. But those weren't Horatio's last words. He lived long enough to hear the gunfire stop altogether while the chaplain and surgeon did their best to make him comfortable. After a while he whispered, "Remember that I leave Lady Hamilton and my daughter Horatio as a legacy to my country. Never forget Horatio." A few moments later he murmured, "Thank God that I have done my duty." At about 4:30, 3 hours after the bullet hit him, Horatio died.
No more Nelson.
The Battle of Trafalgar had been a huge victory. The Brits had lost no ships, but 18 enemy ships had been captured, 1 had exploded, and the rest were so badly damaged that most of them would never sail again. Napoleon's naval power was smashed, and he now had no hope of controlling either the English Channel or the Mediterranean.
Pooh, bum, and the girls!
But it was another 10 years before he was finally defeated by the Brits and Prussians at the Battle of Waterloo. Horatio's body was put in a barrel of brandy to stop it going off while the badly battered Victory was towed to the British base at Gibraltar. There it was transferred into a lead coffin filled with spirits of wine. Emma was at home in bed when a messenger from the Admiralty called to let her know what had happened. He didn't have to say anything.
For 10 hours, I could neither speak nor shed a tear.
Soon the whole country knew about the Battle of Trafalgar.
The Solar Orb, December the 8th, 1805. Nelson, a nation mourns. As news of the late battle near Cape Trafalgar spreads, people don't know whether to jump for joy or sit down and sniffle. All over the country, ballads and hymns are being composed in praise of Lord Nelson, who died so heroically at the moment of his greatest victory over the French. Streets, squares, ships, pubs, gooseberries, carnations, racehorses, and even a prize ram have all been named in Nelson's honour. The Orb says, "Nelson was the greatest Englishman who ever lived. God bless you, Horatio."
At the beginning of December, the Victory was towed to Greenwich, where Horatio's body lay in state for 3 days. Then he was put aboard a barge and rowed upriver by some of his sailors, escorted by black-draped boats and watched by silent crowds along the riverbanks. The next day, 10,000 troops led the funeral procession through the streets of London to St. Paul's Cathedral, where Nelson had asked to be buried. The coffin was carried on a special carriage, made to look like the Victory, and ahead of it marched sailors carrying the Victory's flag, still full of shot holes from the battle. The crowds of mourners were so quiet that the only sound as the procession passed was the rustle of the men all taking off their hats. Inside St. Paul's, the service went on for 4 hours before Horatio was finally lowered into his tomb in the crypt. The sailors who had carried the flag were meant to furl it and place it neatly on the coffin, but when the moment came, they couldn't bring themselves to do it. Instead, they ripped it up and stuffed the bits inside their jackets as mementos of their fave admiral. Sadly, although the Brits spent a fortune on his funeral, they were too stingy to carry out Horatio's last request. His money was divided up between his brothers, sisters, and Fanny. But poor Emma never got a sausage. She wasn't even allowed to go to the funeral. In 1813, Emma's cash ran out, and she was put in prison for debt. The following year, she took Horatio to live in Calais, where she started drinking heavily, and died in 1815. Horatio came back to England, married a vicar, had 9 children, and lived to the ripe old age of 81.
Here's to Horatio.
Hip hip hooray! Hip hip hooray! Hip hip hooray!
Today, memorials to heroic Horatio can still be found all over the country, most famous of all being Nelson's Column, which was built in London's Trafalgar Square in 1842. The column is 45 metres high, and the bronze panels round the base show scenes from Horatio's battles, made from melted-down French cannon that he captured. Perched on the top is a 5-metre-high statue of Horatio, looking horribly heroic. Horatio would have been pleased by all the monuments and memorials, but he'd be even more pleased to know that he would still be horribly famous 200 years after his great victory.